Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today is a schmooze day, which means that we're going to have three people talking who have no plan, and I have no agenda for what they're going to talk about. It's one of those days where I ask our speakers to talk about whatever is on their minds, and usually we come up with something interesting that maybe we can all share, and sometimes we just sort of take turns. Anyway, my speakers today in London is Rebecca Johnson, who's the head of the Acronym Institute. No, she's not in London. She's in, tell me again, Rebecca, where did you say you moved?
I'm in a little place down by the on the Sussex coast called Hove. Most people have heard of Brighton, but not of Hove, but here I am.
Okay, well, I talked to Mary Caldor in Brighton just 2 days ago, or Friday. So you're neighbors, I gather. How far are you from Brighton?
Yeah, I mean, Brighton and Hove used to be two villages and is now a kind of a city.
Okay.
A small one by the sea.
All right, very good. And in Chicago, Ward Wilson, who is the director of the Realist Revolt, which I can't, he can explain it to you, but it's new, so I can't. So I'll let him do that in a minute. And here closer to home is Danny Harvey, who's here in Toronto with me. And Danny is a professor of geography at the University of Toronto and very preoccupied with and doing excellent research on global warming issues. So everybody can say what's on your mind today, and we'll see whether or not there are similar things on people's minds. Let's let Rebecca start off and say what you're thinking about these days.
Well, essentially, I'm still thinking about how to get rid of all nuclear weapons.
Imagine that. That's been your preoccupation for the last 30 years, hasn't it?
Well, it's actually rather longer than that, Meta, as I've been reminded very recently, because it's the 40th anniversary of the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp starting. Mm-hmm. And so since I lived there for 5 years, there've been a number of events down there, but we didn't get much media until a new film on Greenham called Mothers of the Revolution, which was kind of silly name from our point of view, but you know, it's the director and the producers who do that sort of thing. But it was launched at the London Film Festival just last week.
Oh,
part of the British Film Institute, and it's ended up being kind of quite big, and it brings together some of us from different parts of Greenham to kind of talk about that, you know, how it was essentially that we got rid of the crews, the Pershing, the SS-20s. So really from, you know, the initial walk to, which was from Wales to Greenham in September of 1981, which I didn't go on because I was on a Trans-Siberian going in the opposite direction back from teaching in Japan. But from there to the INF Treaty, which was the point at which I left, but then others carried on until the whole Greenham nuclear air base was restored to the people as common land, from whom it had been stolen for war purposes, and then it was finally restored. So that's kind of, it's been a bit of a crazy whirlwind, because suddenly loads of people are wanting to talk about nuclear weapons with me, but I'm always talking about climate as well as nuclear. So I'm so delighted to meet with Danny, because I'm very much involved with Extinction Rebellion, XR, and XR Peace, and to me these two things absolutely, interconnect. Climate destruction and nuclear war both are the fundamental extinction events that can destroy all life on Earth. And back in the 1980s, I was only just older than some of these young climate activists, and ended up at a nuclear base and doing whatever I could, through nonviolent disruption and action, to draw attention, to highlight the humanitarian madness of it, and also, you know, the doctrinal madness of it, which I'm very much looking forward to Ward to getting, you know, more discussion with Ward about here. And then the other thing that has just been very much in our minds, partly because of horrendous events recently here, but it is the violence against women and girls. A policeman abusing his position as a policeman and his power in COVID to stop, you know, stop people walking home and question them, use that power to stop, to handcuff, to rape, and then murder a young woman called Sarah Everard, who was just walking home. And since then, there's just been so much that's come out about all the kind of invisible, or at least in public terms, killings of women and girls, and how particularly Black and minoritized women are even less likely than Sarah, who was a white woman, to have, you know, the police held to account if they are part of doing it, or if they fail to act on it. And so that's just, and of course, this was something that was very alive to us at Greenham, where a lot of violence was used against us from police, from soldiers, from local vigilantes. So those are really the three things that connect on my mind today.
Thank you. Although we are both, all of us, I think, very concerned about both global issues, global warming and nuclear weapons, it's really hard to make the connection when talking to somebody in the general public, to show that these are, that to deal with one of them, really you need to deal with both. And I'm hoping somebody can put something on that hook that I've been waiting for so long, some really good logical connection that I can make when I'm speaking to people about it. Anyway, Danny, tell us where your mind is these days, and let's see if you and Ward and Rebecca are thinking in similar terms.
Well, I'm really delighted to be here with these the two other guests who are concerned with the issues of nuclear war and nuclear weapons, because that's actually something that is on my mind these days. And it's through a group that we have in Toronto called Science for Peace, which you used to be president of. And now Richard Sandbrook is president. And we're still working on it, but sort of the theme for the next 2 years of Science for Peace is going to be what we call the Decisive Decade, focusing jointly on demilitarization and decarbonization. And, you know, this decade is decisive with regard to both global warming and nuclear arms proliferation, because, you know, if we haven't turned global emissions around by 2030, if they're not on their way down, you know, it's just going to be too late. I mean, it's already too late in some respects, but, you know, it's still not impossible to even comply with the 1.5 degree warming limit. I was looking at the latest projections from the IPCC, the Science Working Group report that just came out for the sixth assessment report, AR6. I'll talk about that later. But anyway, I do actually see basis for some hope. Part of that hope is getting early reductions in methane emissions. And I just read this morning in the newspaper, in the Globe and Mail, that the US and other countries are getting some success in expanding the network of countries that are committing to a near-term 30% reduction in methane emissions. And that is a big step forward. But anyway, this decade is decisive, is going to be decisive with regard to global warming, but it's also decisive with regard to the nuclear weapons fleets, because either, you know, the major nuclear powers are going to modernize and expand their nuclear fleets, spending trillions of dollars, or they won't. And of course, two other guests know more about this and may need to correct me if I'm a little bit wrong, but it seems like this is going to be a decisive decade for that. So that, and I think there's a ring to it, the decisive decade. So that's sort of our theme, is very much bringing together these two issues. And Richard and I are sort of toying with an idea of writing a paper and maybe bringing on other people on the many links between demilitarization and decarbonization. Now, one of the links is not actually that significant. I mean, people think that the military itself is a large source of greenhouse gas emissions. And I mean, you can quote facts that make it sound like that, but if you actually put it in context, I mean, I did a quick estimate for a paper that's about to be published on, you know, what's the steel use, right? The annual steel use associated with all the militaries in the world. And it's between 1/3 and 1/5 the amount of steel that goes into food beverage steel cans for food packaging. And I mean, you know, we may have 10,000 or 30,000 fighter jets in the world. You know, we might be making another 1,000 or 2,000 a year, but we're making just under 100 million cars every year. There's over 1 billion cars in the world. So yes, in absolute terms, the military greenhouse gas emissions look big, but they're just swamped by our everyday consumerism. Okay, so that isn't to say there aren't important connections between the military and climate, but they are, but they involve, stop me when I've gone on too long, because there's actually quite a long list. Okay, I mean, it's just the whole environment of mistrust, right, is impeding cooperation. I mean, some of the best from an engineering and technical point of view solutions or regional solutions to the question of decarbonization are going to require cooperation between countries that are rivals, right? Or might be going to war with each other, right? So, you know, that's not good for cooperation. That's not good for decarbonization. You know, there's just enormous amounts of talent, right, that's being sucked into military research. And the money too is the greenhouse gas emissions may indeed be negligible compared to everything else, but the money certainly is not.
Right. Well, you've definitely set an agenda for 3 or 4 conversations, and we just have one. But let's see what's on Ward's mind these days.
Well, let's see. Kind of programmatically, I've recently taken on 3 research associates. They keep volunteering. And I'm now working on co-authoring papers on crisis stability, the nuclear weapons as a currency of power, comparing them to chariots, mounted knights, and battleships, and takedown of Thomas Schelling. It turns out that all the facts that he cites in Arms and Influence, his crucial book, he's the chief nuclear weapons deterrence theorist. Mm-hmm. Turns out that none of the facts he cites in his book are proof that his theory is true. It essentially floats above the whatever, without any connection to reality.
Now, which book is that, Ward?
Arms and Influence is the 3rd one. He talks, or the 2nd one usually, he talks about, in the 1st chapter, he lists 33 different episodes, historical episodes, that he says prove that you can coerce and deter people with nuclear weapons.
Okay, go back, because I'm trying to think of when he wrote that. I actually used to audit a course at Harvard that he taught, but it really wasn't about nuclear weapons. So do you remember the name of the book you're referring to? And I don't think he's written anything lately, has he?
Arms and Influence.
When was this? Do you
66.
know? In the 60s.
Yeah.
Did you say? In the 60s?
1966.
Okay, so I thought it was a while back. Quite a while back. Okay.
Yes, but he remains the central figure in deterrence theory. Okay. And if you can take him down, then it is the main support post for the entire field. So but what I've been thinking about is I was listening to a book on my phone about the American Constitutional Convention. And they were talking about how there was one subject that never came up, but that was on everyone's mind. And that was slavery. It was in the background everywhere, and it affected everything. And people thought about it. No one said the word. And it just rang a bell in my head, because that is exactly the situation we're at with nuclear weapons. They're so dangerous. And yet we never we discuss keeping people we don't like from getting them, but we never talk about the risk. We never talk about the dangers that come in train with having these weapons.
Well, you do, and all my friends do, but you're right. If you turn on the television or watch the newspaper, they never do. That's true.
But I have to say,
let me just say one more thing. The other thing that, and I'm with you that this is the decisive decade, Danny, because I wrote a piece for Foreign Policy called The Age of Frustration. And it lays out, I think, 6 different areas, economic, political, cultural, so on, in which our time period mirrors the 10 years before World War I. And a lot of historians claim that the period before World War I is peculiar because it's so emotional. There's so much kind of loose anger roaming around. And that seems so familiar to me. You know, we don't live in a decade like the 90s when everyone was kind of relaxed and happy and everyone seems to be shouting about something. And those are the decades when big wars break out. So it seems to me that these topics are especially, and I hear you asked for it, so here it is. Climate change equals starvation. Starvation equals war. War equals nuclear war.
I'm not sure starvation does equal war. I think the problem is very frequently when people are starving, they don't have the energy to fight. They sit under a tree and die quietly, or they die of a disease. Actually, they don't usually die of famine itself. They are weakened, and then they get cholera or some other thing and die of that. So I don't think that war is a result of hunger.
Let me make maybe a slightly different set of connections of that, because it's one of the things that I mentioned, and you can see behind me, involvement in XR. But we actually developed XR Peace within that. And the banner basically said something along the lines of, well, I think the simplified form of it was, war and militarism, or militarism causes climate destruction, and climate destruction upholds militarism, or it was making that connection, but making it a little bit more kind of nuanced. It is the recognition that the militarism, or military industrialism, are the primary causes both of climate destruction and of insecurity. And these all, and then the climate emergency is then used as, by states that are still very dependent on military industrial threatening behavior and on nuclear weapons. The 9 now nuclear armed states are some of the very largest of the, climate destroyers in terms of their emissions. But as Danny said, and I think correctly, it's not just about emissions, although militarism is a significant contributor, but it's about the obsession with rivalry over any kind of weapons, whether it goes to the dreadnoughts back before the First World War that Ward's talking about, or the dreadnoughts that the UK is now getting for the next generation of Trident. These are presented as solving a problem that actually they exacerbate and increase not least because they absorb vast amounts of resources that could be better spent on jobs that actually save people's lives and feed people and make the things that people really need. And they distract the political attention. And we see that now. Everybody should actually be recognizing we've got to, stop the, climate, the global heating going up any further. And that takes, drastic, collective, unified action. And yet in the run up to COP26, which is going to be happening in Glasgow, we have these stupid leaders. You know who I'm talking about. Most of them are also heads of nuclear armed countries, but not all. But we have these stupid leaders still talking about, their rivalries, political, military in particular. Now China is being fingered as being we now have this triangular kind of relationship being asserted as the main danger, and China's expansion in the Pacific. But the main danger to all of us is carrying on business as usual in terms of military industrial behavior, and that that has that impacts. But Ward, I want to take issue with you because I do think that from the very beginning, and we reached out to you and you played an important part but from the very beginning, as we were beginning the heavy lifting with the strategy to get what became in 2017 the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that entered into force in January of this year, we talked about the humanitarian impacts, we talked about the environmental impacts, we worked with climate scientists on this, but we also really challenged deterrence. We challenged the myths. Your book, 5 Myths of Nuclear Weapons, but your work with Patricia Lewis and others on really examining and pulling apart for critique these myths of deterrence that have sanitized and made the huge amount of resources for, nuclear weapons of mass destruction to carry on being signed off on by politicians, certainly in Britain and in Canada through NATO and, the 9 nuclear armed states. So debunking deterrence was as important as highlighting the humanitarian and environmental impacts, the actual real impacts of nuclear weapons, for bringing enough states together for 122 of them to adopt a treaty that some 130, 140 of them negotiated multilaterally in the UN General Assembly, and to the utter shame of the nuclear armed states, they boycotted. Well, the treaty exists. It is the best legal political instrument we could possibly have. We just have to now really embed it and make it act on the nuclear armed states. And that's again where what we did at Greenham in disrupting all the military nuclear deployments at the bases and war games and exercise when the weapons were taken out of the bases, that led to making it undeployable for the US to actually carry on deploying both Cruise and Pershing in Western Europe, and as Gorbachev has clearly paid tribute to, which is in the film, Greenham Women and the Peace Movement of Europe made it possible when he came into power in '85 for him, under enormous resource pressure from the kind of military industrial collapse going on in the Soviet Union, it made him reach out to Reagan to talk about beginning to get rid of nuclear weapons. And that is exactly what they did with the INF Treaty. They began the end of the nuclear arms race, but we've still got 13,000 nuclear weapons. So we do have to keep going, because it is still a very, very dangerous world in terms of nuclear war, along with an increasingly dangerous world in which there is a relationship between climate destruction and starvation and desertification and loss of agriculture, which mirrors the nuclear winter that shocked so many people, including people like Reagan, that the scientists developed back in the 80s. We know that climate, global heating is that same but different, because it isn't about, England can turn into the south of France and grow grapes. It's that this is extreme weather. So people can't grow their food. And when people can't grow their food, they become desperate. And when desperate people try to go to places where they can eat and are met with, bombs and guns and military responses, that's when everything becomes so insecure that nuclear weapons could well be used by accident or intent. And we could be in nuclear war. That's the cycle. And that's what we have to stop both ends of.
Okay. Okay, who has a response to that?
Well, I'd just like to add something. If you have a non-zero risk or probability of something happening in any given year, if you wait long enough, sooner or later it's going to happen. So if there's a 1% chance of a nuclear war, by accident even, in any 1 year, then there's only a 99% chance of it not happening in 1 year. So after 10 years, the chance of it not happening is 0.99 to the power of 10, assuming each year is independent of the other. And so the point is, if that power becomes large enough, 0.99 to the power of 30 or 50 or whatever, that's now getting to be a pretty small number. That's the probability of nuclear war not happening by accident. And I fear that the risk of a war by accident is greater than 1% in any 1 year, given the number of near misses we've had already in the last 50 years. So if we don't eliminate nuclear weapons, I think it's a statistical certainty that sooner or later they will be used either by design or by accident. So we must get rid of them, right? We cannot tolerate an even 1% or 0.1% chance of them being used by accident, not if we want our children and grandchildren and their grandchildren to continue on. Now, I'm 65. I'm hoping to live till I'm up to 100 or so. So, if I'm going to die a natural death, the world has to last another 35 years. And, I might be lucky, right? The world might last that long, even in the absence of getting rid of nuclear weapons. But I am very concerned about my daughter, who she's going to live 100 years and die a natural death, right? The world has to last to 2096, right? Because she was born in 1996. So I think the world is really risky. I mean, the probability of our children being able to die a natural death is not actually that great, right? Given the risks we're facing. And so I think, and I've noticed that a lot of the anti-nuclear and anti-war activists are the older generation. And I think, it is incumbent on people of all ages, but certainly those of us in the older generation, if we want to, to live to a ripe old age and die of natural causes, at least not in a nuclear holocaust or the aftermath of that. And if we want our children to have that privilege, then we really have to work tirelessly to eliminate nuclear weapons. So I'm actually new to the nuclear weapons issue. And one of the issues that we have here in Science for Peace is whether or not Canada should withdraw from NATO. And from what little knowledge I have, I can see that NATO really blew it big time. I mean, NATO really blew it after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was an opportunity then to actually forge something more peaceful. And I think NATO is a little bit too militaristic right now. And I think there are people in NATO, but please inform me, if I'm wrong, but my perception is that there are some hawks in NATO who actually are entertaining the idea that nuclear weapons are usable and can function as a deterrent and could even be used in the battlefield. And if that is the case, rather than withdrawing from NATO, I think it's all the more important that Canada stay in NATO and identify other countries or leaders within the group that don't share these mad viewpoints. But I would certainly be interested in hearing what my colleagues in the US and Britain have to say about the continued membership, especially my anti-nuclear colleagues in the US and Britain, what they would have to say about this question. I'm certainly in a minority in Science for Peace, but I think, rather than withdraw, we should take a very strong, proactive leadership. Of course, that requires a prime minister and a leadership with spine, which I think we lack at the moment.
Okay, that I think is the most divisive issue in the whole peace movement.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know if we did a poll, what percentage of people would say that, Canada and some of the other countries should withdraw from NATO. I wouldn't even guess. It might be 50-50. Rebecca, what do you think? And Ward, what do you think the distribution would be on that particular issue?
I'll let Ward reply because I kind of went on a bit long before.
Okay.
Oh, Rebecca. I don't know. If I were going to advise Canada, which is the most presumptuous sentence I've said, in the last 30 years, I would stay in NATO. I think that it's better to be a dissenting voice arguing against nuclear weapons and deterrence within NATO than to be a kid who grabbed his ball and went home.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but then answer the next question. Could Canada sign the TPNW and ratify it and
Absolutely.
still stay in NATO?
Yes,
that is,
absolutely.
I think.
Yeah. Denmark, Spain, Iceland, they're all members of NATO, and all of them have specific prohibitions against nuclear weapons. Iceland doesn't allow any nuclear weapons on their territory and has never since they joined NATO. They joined with that prohibition in place.
With regard to the treaty, Meta, it is one of the things that, again, those of us advocating for the treaty also were divided about specifics of military alliances such as NATO, and I completely agree with Danny, and I was involved at the time when because the INF treaty really within just a short space of years was followed by the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. Now, there are all sorts of geostrategic reasons why that happened, but it was the triumphalism of the West, and in particular, the leaders in the US and UK and France and so on, which blew out of the water the opportunity we all had to, rebuild, renegotiate, change the kind of way in which we related with other countries that we might have different political systems from and so on. The reunification of Germany was hugely celebratory, but it just ended up becoming that more countries joined NATO right on the border of a Russia that at that time was falling apart, needed support, needed, not, and was the vultures from the industries of West Germany, the UK, the US, and so on, who moved in on the newly emerging Russia when it had its drunken leader Yeltsin instead of, who, as probably remember, was basically displaced Gorbachev in a coup there, and and the rest kind of follows from that. And so we've ended up with Putin, who is another kind of very much strong-armed in the model of Stalin sort of leader for Russia. And we are reaping that whirlwind of Putin's, massive support amongst the Russian people, because they just saw how the West didn't engage in a peace-building, constructive way. But as far as the treaty is concerned, the treaty is compatible for any country who is currently in a nuclear armed alliance, or who, like Australia or Japan or South Korea, has sort of nuclear deterrence arrangements with the US. To get out of those arrangements and join the treaty, they only have to commit to not having nuclear weapons used on their behalf, to not deploying nuclear weapons at all in their on their territory, and so on. But they can stay in a security alliance, even if others within that alliance have nuclear weapons. And as Ward said, actually, the point is that that's probably at this stage in history a better thing to do, because they can increasingly move NATO towards recognizing that, given the threats we all face, from climate, and the destruction of the environment, and all of those kinds of things, militarism isn't the answer. Okay, but security with a human security, humanitarian security is, and that can be done through alliances.
Okay, I don't have any problem with that. I'm on your side, but I don't know whether legally it's really tenable, because just a few days ago, I did a talk show with John Burroughs at the Lawyers Against Nuclear Weapons in New York. And I asked him whether he thought that a country could stay in NATO and still sign and ratify the TPNW. And basically, I think I can't give you a one-sentence quotation, but it pretty much comes down to, if a country is party to anything that involves nuclear weapons, no, you have to absolutely get rid of any participation in any way with anything involving the use of the maintenance of retention of nuclear weapons. Yeah, and that would, okay?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
The prohibition for states to denounce nuclear weapons is a doctrine of NATO. It is not part of the treaty. It is a doctrine that was promulgated, I don't know, in the last 30 years. And various members of NATO currently have prohibitions on nuclear weapons and are part of NATO. Iceland is the premier example. And I read about this on NATO's website. They have a list of all the different countries and how they came into the organization. So NATO stands around and talks a lot about how, Hillary Clinton said that as long as there's a NATO, it's going to be a nuclear NATO. And they say all that stuff. But as a legal matter of what's in the treaty, there's nothing.
In reality, NATO has war plans. They have people appointed to do it. They have a complete, it's not like just a doctrine or theoretical. Yeah,
but Meta, you have to make a distinction between what is NATO today, and you're quite right. NATO does not want any member of NATO to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, because they want to carry on having nuclear weapons, because that's their mindset. That's what everybody in NATO has been trained to be deploying those weapons. But Ward is absolutely correct that it was not in any founding treaty of NATO. It is a doctrine adopted subsequently, and that there are a number of countries that actually do not participate. And that word participate is the crucial aspect. So a state, now what it requires is that those countries are brave enough to stand up to NATO and say, you know what, yes, we have had nuclear weapons on our territory, as Germany and Netherlands and Italy and so on, but we're not going to have nuclear weapons on our territory now, which means you need to take them take them away. It puts the onus of the responsibility on the owners of the nuclear weapons, which in NATO's case is the US. They would then say, we're also not going to engage in war games that involve the nuclear weapons. Now that's going to change, that's a challenge for NATO. So yes, you're right, NATO doesn't want any of the countries to join, but the treaty doesn't make it necessary for any country that joins the TPNW, the Nuclear Ban Treaty, to have to withdraw from NATO. That will be a negotiation with NATO, within NATO. And the more countries that join, the first brave country to do it will basically break some of that that
look
apart.
here.
And if 2 or 3 can do it together, everything changes.
But not only
Canada already does not have nuclear weapons on our land and haven't for many years.
But
So
Canada
does that
plays
make
nuclear
us,
war
does that
game.
make us of pure? No, we're part
No.
of a whole thing that would use nuclear weapons. Their policy is to use nuclear weapons. As long as we're part of that, I don't see how we can say we're not really part of it.
No.
Yes,
So-
we are.
So to join the treaty will require Canada to make domestic political changes in which it will also have some kind of a signed agreement that says that that is not prepared to that it will not be part of the nuclear planning group, for example, and take part in military exercises that involve the deployment, and exercises that are war games that involve how nuclear weapons are fired from other parts of NATO. So this is this distinction. Legally, it is possible to join the treaty and stay in NATO, but change the relationship that you have within NATO. Now, that will require a negotiation with NATO. That's what Spain did. That's what Iceland did, etc.
and
A lot of that was hidden at the time.
these
This will
negotiations,
now be out in the open.
right, these negotiations have gone on in the past. France, for a long time, did not participate in nuclear exercises as a part of NATO because they wanted to build their own nuclear weapons force. But
They're still partly outside the nuclear planning
they
group.
said, we're not going to participate in your exercises. They stayed a part of NATO. They just had a special status that they created for them. It's perfectly possible to do. They just don't want to admit that it's possible. And the reason they're running scared is because if you've looked at any of the polling numbers that ICANN has done and other people have done, the domestic support in Germany, in Belgium, in Canada for the TPNW is enormously high against nuclear weapons.
Absolutely
People
right.
the ordinary people don't like nuclear weapons and they want them to go away. And leaders ignore that kind of sentiment at their peril, at least in democracies.
And ordinary
it's
people
not at their
vote for
peril.
parliaments.
We just had an election and there was no conversation in the campaigns about that. They don't talk about that. They're not afraid. The public in Canada wants to stay in NATO. The majority want to stay in NATO. Majority would, like almost 80%, would want to get rid of nuclear weapons. It's the discontinuity between those two policies that leaves people hanging.
Well,
Okay, but I think we need to stop obsessing about NATO
Yeah.
in this context, because I think the thing is still to keep a clear message. The nuclear weapons do not deter that whole range of threats that were dissuaded. With or without NATO, nuclear weapons don't actually deter. No, then also that even threatening to use them puts in position the possibility that they can be used, the possibility that there can be an accident and have other kinds of things go wrong, and that can through miscalculation, misadventure, human error, computer error, and that this could be used for one nuclear weapon to be fired, which would be a humanitarian catastrophe on its own. But more than that, could very well, in these very unstable times, when they are still, really, I haven't seen this much nuclear saber rattling going on since the 1980s, when we were arguing for the nuclear weapons to be pulled back from being right on the front line where they could hit their targets within 15 minutes if fired from anywhere in Europe, at anywhere else in Europe, east and west. So we do have, I think we need to keep ourselves focused on why it's so important to sign up sign up countries to the treaty. There's still a lot of non-nuclear countries that have to sign up. There are, as Ward says, it's really important. There's big debates. In Germany's just had an election and it looks like the Greens are going to be part of it. The Greens, are all committed to the treaty. So, Norway's just had an election which looks as if the Labour Party is going to be the major party. Now, Norway helped us launch the entire kind of, humanitarian disarmament campaign with the Oslo Treaty, with the Oslo Conference back in 2013. Then the reason why NATO can't say that they all joined in and boycotted the multilateral negotiations is because the Netherlands actually participated throughout the whole negotiations for the treaty at the UN in 2017. Why? Because their parliament instructed the government. Why? Because the parliament was hearing from the public, from civil society. Now, civil society is even more committed to getting rid of nuclear weapons now than it was in 2017. So we have to carry on saying countries can join the treaty. They will have to renegotiate their situation with NATO, and that will change NATO. But then what we did in getting the INF treaty led to changes that we hadn't foreseen at all, such as, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and nearly the collapse of NATO. And you know how NATO ended up not collapsing? It was because the business, the industrial masters, the profiteers who had industries in every single state in the United States, they were the ones that got together and really forced into the narrative that the joblessness for the US military industrial complex would be so vast that what Clinton, because he was the president by the time that this was really being pushed, that he had to shore up NATO. And they brought in this interoperability idea, which meant basically that a lot of NATO countries, including new ones coming in, would have to buy American. Who was paying for that? Not those countries, because they couldn't afford it. It was American taxpayers. And that saved NATO at that time, to the detriment of security around the world ever since.
Meta, I think you're exactly right. I think the most important barrier to having a successful challenge to nuclear weapons is the fact that people don't talk about the risk and the danger. And I think there are specific reasons for that. And if I can be forgiven, I'm going to tease you. I'm doing a little research that I don't want to announce just at the moment, but I believe that there is widespread, measurable evidence that nuclear war, the risk of nuclear war, is on 80% of people's minds. A huge number of Americans think about and worry about nuclear war. And our task is just to get them over the hump. Stop worrying in private, stop worrying alone, and start talking with your friends and neighbors, and you'll find out you're not alone. And so for me, at least, I see that resistance to dealing with a difficult problem as the key problem. And Danny, I'd be interested to know if you feel that in climate change and what you did in climate change to kind of get people past that resistance. Oh no, this problem is too big for me. I can't, do anything about it.
I think has done it. I think it's nature. I think what science and scientists have done is prepare the public, but no amount of cajoling and warning really had much effect. I mean, it had a little effect, but it was mostly lip service. But it seems that what's really getting people's attention is Mother Nature herself. When you have fires everywhere and floods everywhere and unusual storms everywhere and notable sea level rise, people actually see it happening. And I think that, and of course, all of the protest movements and the rallies and the science, I mean, that sort of conditions and softens up the resistance. But unfortunately, we've had to wait until measurable adverse impacts start occurring. And so, as an activist, in one sense, you want there to be some mini disasters to get people going, to avoid the much bigger disasters. Although ideally, we wouldn't even need mini disasters, that people would look at the evidence and proceed rationally.
Eric Fawcett used to maintain that we'll never get rid of nuclear weapons until there is actually another nuclear explosion someplace. When there actually is one used, then people will say, now we have to ban them.
That'll be really tragic if we have to go that far. And it's unlikely that only one would be used. As you said, there'll be retaliation or whatever. So we have to do everything we can. Now, this is another controversial statement or question.
You're the troublemaker on this.
For our other two guests. But I mean, okay, you can say, okay, we're going to renounce first use of nuclear weapons. I mean, right now, NATO wants to, and the US wants to retain the option of first use in case they're losing a conventional war. So if you see a threat through conventional war, now obviously we should do everything we can to defuse those threats. But if you see a threat through conventional weapons and you're going to renounce using nuclear weapons as a backup, then a corollary might be, well, then I need to improve my conventional defense capabilities. And particularly, I'm very alarmed with the threat of China invading Taiwan. And so this is another issue we're talking about in Science for Peace. I mean, one of the things we're going to be lobbying for is for Canada to join the TPNW. Another thing we're going to lobby for is for Canada to ban exports. I mean, Canada's like the third or fourth exporter of military weapons in the world after the US, UK, maybe China. And, we're arming both sides in the Middle East, for example. But I guess the question, and it requires some research, or maybe you know the answers already, but I mean, especially if we're banning nuclear weapons and renouncing first use, I'm not suggesting that countries should be defenseless. So, and if countries have the right to defend themselves, then why would you prohibit exporting truly defensive weapons? And so for me personally, I would say, let's build up Taiwan's defenses, truly defensive weapons for Taiwan. So what would you say about that?
I think obviously the best thing would be to have people be more peaceful and have militarism fade away and all that. But I think that the choice between a nuclear war with, 200 million people killed or more, and a World War II style war with 70 million killed, I think that's a no-brainer. I think, militarism is bad. Militarism plus nuclear weapons is just a nightmare. Mm-hmm. So I come down on the, do whatever you have to do to get rid of nuclear weapons. And then the thing about getting rid of nuclear weapons is it ought to build a sense of accomplishment. It ought to build hope and confidence. It ought to make people think, wow, we did one hard thing. We can do some more. We can manage climate change. We'll make sacrifice. We'll do this. We'll do that. Right now we just have a record of failure. And that makes people discouraged and think that nothing will ever work. I'm perhaps a foolish optimist. I think it's possible to get people to think about nuclear weapons in a serious, sensible way and eliminate them.
I think the critical thing in the most recent period to raise awareness of climate was when the young kids came out and said, this is our future. Greta Thunberg, powerful. She just spoke in very simple sort of language about, listen to the science. But you got to do something. Stop messing around with all these other extraneous things. And if we can see that militarism is one of those extraneous things to our real security, the security that is actually going to give your granddaughter a future, if that's to be possible. And this is where I think the very powerful message that got me living outside a nuclear base for 5 years in the 80s and completely changing my life is exactly the same thing. It was to get rid of the nightmares of nuclear war by doing something to try to stop it. That's what I'm hearing all the time from the young climate activists, that you know, and that's how the change is going to happen. So I don't think more militarism works as a solution, although of course it's not going to be got rid of, but I think it's more and more people just actually recognize it. Netta, you mentioned Eric, who and there were lots of people at the time that in the 80s just said you'll never get rid of nuclear weapons until there's a big nuclear accident, a big nuclear explosion. We also kept hearing, and I was quite open to this because I avidly read lots of science fiction, the only way you're going to get rid of nuclear weapons, or you know, and I would add this now to climate change, is if something happens that makes the whole earth, you know, all the peoples of the world realize you stand, or, you know, you live or die together, one way or the other. And that's where we are much more with climate, because climate will be a destroyer of you know, the environment and humanity and all the species in slow motion, where nuclear war would have been that, you know, in a flash of light. But they're both extinction events. And at a certain point, the tipping point with climate, if we go past that, then it won't come fast, but it will come. And that's what the young people get, because it's their future, and that's what they're trying to say. And that's why I think we do have to connect these things. And I think militarism is a problem for both, because it adds to climate destruction in all its production. It distracts from unifying the earth in actually working together to solve the climate destruction. What we're going to see in Glasgow with COP26 is going to be lots of nationalistic fighting amongst those states. That's part of the problem.
That
and
is
it's not going to be part of the solution until they recognize we live or die together. Chinese, Russian, European, Latin American, North American, we live or die by whether we can work together to solve these two great, big existential crises.
We should have learned a little bit of that already from COVID, because indeed, you know,
Absolutely.
that the same message should be drawn. Our time is up. And I think that particular message is one that I'm glad to end with, Rebecca, because I heartily agree with it. And I think I would wonder if Ward and Danny don't also agree with that general notion. We have to learn that we live or die together.
I think that's a good way of putting it, and we need to hammer away that message.
Okay, it's been fun, bracing and you know, difficult, but it just reminds us we have work to do. So we're all doing it, and I thank you for it. It's wonderful. Carry on.
And can I just pay tribute to your great Toronto citizen, Setsuko Thurlow, who did so much to help us get that treaty and is carried on. And I just think I'm so inspired by her. And,
yes.
You know, she's a treasure.
She is indeed. And you three are all treasures. So thank you so much. Bye now.
Thank you, Maida.
You're a great treasure too.
Yes.
Bringing us together.
Bye.